private tarmac was blindingly bright under the hot summer sun. A pristine, white luxury jet sat ready. Inside the ultra-exclusive first-class cabin, soft leather seats gleamed. By the window sat a single dad in a faded shirt, his young son quietly reading a book. The surrounding VIP clients stared at them with naked disgust. A billionaire investor scoffed, pointing a finger. "Just go away." Cruel laughter echoed through the cabin. The father stood up, refusing to argue. Suddenly, the heavy cockpit door slammed open. A frantic ground technician rushed aboard. The pilot barked rapidly into the radio. The jet was grounded. His name was Michael Turner. 45 years old, with strong, heavily calloused hands scarred from years of gripping cold steel, a quiet, immovable demeanor, and the kind of tired, hyper-protective eyes that only a struggling, single father possesses. He wasn't a hedge fund manager. He wasn't a ruthless venture capitalist or a Silicon Valley disruptor. He was an independent, highly specialized technical contractor, a man who lived his life entirely behind the scenes, making sure the world's most complex machines didn't tear themselves apart. Sitting right next to him, his small legs barely reaching the edge of the oversized, cream-colored Italian leather seat, was his 9-year-old son, Ethan. Ethan's eyes were wide as saucers, completely and utterly mesmerized by the sheer, staggering luxury of the cabin. It was his very first time flying, let alone stepping foot onto a $65 million Gulfstream private jet. He gently touched the polished Macassar ebony wood paneling as if it were made of pure magic. Michael hadn't snuck on board. He hadn't won a contest. He had been personally, urgently invited. The owner of this magnificent, soaring palace was Richard Hale, a 52-year-old tech billionaire with a global empire. Richard and Michael were quietly collaborating on a massive, highly confidential structural engineering project. Richard, unlike many men of his wealth, knew exactly what Michael's brain was worth. He knew it was worth its weight in solid gold. So he had absolutely insisted that Michael fly with him to the final site inspection in Geneva, Switzerland. And because it was a long holiday weekend, Richard had graciously, warmly allowed little Ethan to come along. But Richard, overwhelmed by frantic, last-minute merger phone calls on the blazing hot tarmac outside, had made one critical mistake. He had completely forgotten to introduce Michael to the rest of the passengers before boarding. The cabin was filled to the brim with Richard's primary financial backers, a viciously elite, tight-knit circle of private equity investors. They were the kind of people who measured a man's entire worth strictly by the brand of his Swiss watch, the cut of his bespoke suit, and the zip code of his primary residence. Michael was wearing a plain, slightly faded charcoal button-down shirt that had seen far too many wash cycles and comfortable scuffed brown work khakis. He wore a simple digital watch with a cracked resin strap. From the exact moment Michael and Ethan stepped onto the thick, plush cashmere carpet of the cabin, the atmosphere had turned instantly, brutally frigid. The investors stopped their conversations. They looked at the father and son as if a stray, mangy dog had just wandered into a private Michelin star tasting room. They exchanged deeply annoyed, condescending glances, whispering harsh judgments behind their crystal champagne flutes. Directly across the wide aisle sat Eleanor Vance. She was the CEO of a ruthless venture capital firm, draped in designer silk that likely cost more than Michael's first car. She stared openly, unapologetically, at Michael's worn-out shoes. "Excuse me," Eleanor said loudly. Her voice was dripping with pure, unadulterated snobbery, intentionally elevating her pitch to ensure every single billionaire in the cabin could hear her. "Richard explicitly told us this was a highly confidential investor flight. We need absolute, uncompromising privacy to discuss a $4 billion acquisition. Who exactly are you, and why are you in our section?" Michael looked at her calmly, his face a perfectly unreadable mask. He felt the heavy, suffocating weight of their collective judgment pressing down on him. He knew exactly what they saw. A younger, incredibly arrogant executive sitting directly behind Eleanor, a 30-something crypto millionaire named Carter Hayes, let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He adjusted his platinum Rolex and leaned forward. "Probably the caterer who got lost looking for the galley," Carter sneered loudly. "Look, buddy, I don't know how you got past security, but this isn't commercial economy class. Just go away. Find a jump seat in the back with the luggage before Richard gets here and has you physically removed." A chorus of soft, cruel, entitled laughter rippled effortlessly through the luxurious cabin. Ethan shrank back deep into his massive leather seat, instantly losing his wide-eyed wonder. He clutched his worn Spider-Man comic book tightly to his chest. He looked up at his dad, his lower lip trembling slightly, tears threatening to spill. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking, "are we not supposed to be here? Did we do something wrong?" Michael felt a massive spike of hot, violent anger erupt in his chest. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached, but he immediately swallowed the rage. He didn't care about his own ego. He didn't care about defending his honor to a room full of strangers. He only cared about his son feeling safe, confident, and secure. Arguing with a cabin full of arrogant, hostile billionaires would only scare Ethan more. "We're exactly where we're supposed to be, buddy," Michael whispered softly, leaning down and warmly squeezing his son's shaking shoulder. "Don't listen to them." He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up to his full height, his broad shoulders towering over the arrogant executive for a brief, terrifying second. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't throw a tantrum or demand respect. He simply looked down at Eleanor and Carter with a cold, blank, utterly fearless stare. "If our mere presence is disrupting your morning," Michael said quietly, his voice cutting through the cabin like a heavy blade, "my son and I will gladly move to the aft lounge until takeoff. Enjoy your champagne. Ma'am." He turned to grab their small canvas duffel bags, fully prepared to walk away from the insult and protect his son's peace of mind. But before he could take a single, heavy step down the carpeted aisle, the unmistakable, high-pitched, bone-rattling screech of an electronic master alarm pierced the quiet cabin. The soft, ambient classical music playing through the cabin's hidden speakers immediately cut out, replaced by a harsh, rhythmic blaring. The subtle, powerful, vibrating hum of the massive twin Rolls-Royce engines suddenly whined down, the pitch dropping rapidly until it died into an eerie, terrifying hollow silence. The heavy, reinforced security door to the cockpit was violently kicked open from the inside. The captain emerged into the cabin. His face was ash-pale, thick beads of nervous sweat forming rapidly on his forehead. He wasn't looking at the VIPs. He was holding a heavy radio handset tightly to his mouth, barking frantic, highly technical emergency codes directly to the airport control tower. "Tower, this is Hale 1. Abort. We have a critical subsystem failure on the auxiliary hydraulic relay. Requesting immediate ground tech intercept on the tarmac. We are scrubbing the departure slot." That heavy, devastating word hung in the chilled air conditioning like a lead weight. Scrubbing. Absolute panic, followed by extreme explosive irritation, instantly erupted in the first-class cabin. "What do you mean, scrubbing?" Eleanor demanded, violently standing up from her seat, spilling a massive drop of her expensive orange mimosa down the front of her pristine silk dress. "We have a multi-billion-dollar acquisition meeting in Geneva in exactly 8 hours. If we are not in that boardroom by 3 p.m. local time, the European regulators will kill the entire deal. We absolutely cannot be delayed. Do you know how much money is sitting on this plane right now?" "I apologize, ma'am, but I don't have a choice." The captain snapped back tersely, his professional facade cracking under the immense pressure. His panicked eyes darted back to the flashing, angry red lights illuminating the inside of the dark cockpit. "It's not a primary engine failure, but the secondary auxiliary control module is entirely unresponsive. It governs the backup landing gear deployment and the secondary braking pressure. FAA regulations explicitly prohibit us from moving an inch on this tarmac until it is completely resolved and cleared by a certified engineer." Carter Hayes, the arrogant executive, threw his crystal glass onto the table, shattering it. He pointed a trembling finger at the pilot. "I don't care about regulations. Override the system. Fly the damn plane, or I swear to God I will have Richard fire you before you can even take your uniform off." "Sir, if I override this, we could lose all braking power upon landing in Geneva," the pilot yelled back. "How long to get a certified tech out here?" Richard Hale, who had just rushed up the rear stairs after finishing his call, demanded, his face flushed with extreme, desperate stress. At this specific private airport? The pilot grimaced, rubbing his temples in despair. Best case scenario, 3 hours just to get a qualified tech dispatched and out onto the tarmac. Worst case, if the module is actually fried, we have to order the part from Seattle. We are completely grounded until tomorrow morning. The cabin exploded in furious, angry murmurs. Laptops were slammed shut. Phones were pulled out frantically. Millions, perhaps billions of dollars were literally slipping away, evaporating into thin air second by second. Carter Hayes threw his hands up in absolute unhinged disgust. He turned and glared directly at Michael and Ethan, who were still standing quietly in the aisle holding their bags. Unbelievable, Carter sneered loudly, his face red with rage, desperate to find a scapegoat for the disaster. Everything was perfectly fine until you two walked on board with your cheap bags. Must be bad luck. Richard, get the caterer and his kid off this plane right now. Michael completely ignored the venomous insult. His eyes weren't on the angry, screaming billionaires. His eyes were intensely, laser-focused on the open cockpit door. His highly trained ears were perfectly tuned to the specific, high-frequency whine coming from the avionics bay, hidden deep beneath the floorboards. He listened carefully to the rapid, panicked, highly technical radio chatter going back and forth between the sweating pilot and the confused airport ground crew. Michael knew this specific jet model. He didn't just know how to ride in it. He knew its exact, immensely complex mechanical anatomy better than he knew the back of his own hand. He immediately recognized the fatal, notorious flaw of this specific model's auxiliary module. It was incredibly sensitive to sudden, extreme barometric pressure changes caused by the blazing tarmac heat, often throwing terrifying, flight-canceling red warnings that were actually nothing more than digital ghosts, false positives. He didn't jump forward recklessly. He didn't shout over the billionaires to get attention or prove his worth. He calmly reached down, patted Ethan's head gently, and told him to stay put. Michael walked slowly, quietly past the screaming, frantic investors. He stopped right at the metal threshold of the cockpit. He didn't cross the line into the restricted area. "Excuse me, Captain," Michael said. His voice was incredibly calm, dropping an octave, acting as a deep, steady, immovable anchor in a sea of absolute screaming panic. It cut through the noise of the billionaires effortlessly. The pilot spun around, looking intensely annoyed and overwhelmed. "Sir, please return to your seat immediately. I am dealing with a critical aviation emergency." "Are you getting a code 40B on the primary diagnostic display?" Michael asked, his voice sharp, precise, and entirely impossible to ignore. "An auxiliary hydraulic secondary pressure warning, specifically flashing in the bypass sector?" The pilot froze completely. The heavy radio in his trembling hand slowly lowered. He stared at the quiet man in the faded shirt with profound, absolute shock. How in the hell did you know that? That code is encrypted. It's not on any of the passenger displays." "Because I know exactly what's causing it," Michael replied smoothly, his face hard, looking the panicked pilot dead in the eye. "And if you stop yelling at the tower and let me talk to your ground tech on that radio right now, I can get this $60 million plane in the air in exactly 12 minutes. Nahun, if you firmly believe that absolute silent competence and calm, surgical timing are always infinitely more powerful than loud, arrogant laughter, hit that subscribe button to witness the exact moment this single dad saves the millionaire's jet. The entire first-class cabin went dead, terrifyingly silent. The screaming stopped. Eleanor froze with her phone halfway to her ear. Carter Hayes' mouth hung slightly open in dumbfounded shock. Even Richard Hale stood completely frozen in the middle of the aisle, staring at his quiet, unassuming technical partner. The pilot looked closely at Michael, his eyes scanning the faded clothes, the scuffed boots, deeply conflicted. Aviation protocol was incredibly, ruthlessly strict. You don't just let a random, unidentified passenger diagnose a highly sensitive, $65 million flying machine. If anything went wrong, the pilot would lose his license instantly. "Sir, with all due respect, I am a 20-year veteran commercial pilot. the captain said cautiously, taking a step back. This is a highly restricted, complex avionics issue. Who exactly are you? Michael didn't puff up his chest. He didn't brag or demand an apology from the cabin. He simply stated a cold, heavy, undeniable historical fact. My name is Michael Turner. Before I started my own independent contracting firm, I spent 15 grueling years as the senior lead civil aviation maintenance engineer for Boeing's Advanced Experimental Division. I literally helped write the core diagnostic manual for the hydraulic subsystems on this exact airframe model. I know exactly how it breathes. The pilot's eyes went incredibly wide. The heavy, suffocating tension in his rigid shoulders instantly vanished, replaced by the desperate, overwhelming relief of a drowning man who had just found a solid lifeline in a violent storm. Captain, Michael continued, his voice perfectly steady, never once stepping his foot into the cockpit or attempting to touch a single dial or switch. I will not touch your controls. I will not override your legal command of this vessel. But I guarantee you, on my life, the physical hydraulic module is perfectly fine. The issue is a false positive reading from the ambient temperature sensor located on the secondary bypass valve. It's trapped in a thermal feedback loop from the tarmac heat. Michael pointed a single steady finger toward the complex, terrifying digital display glowing bright red on the dashboard. Have your ground technician go under the belly and open hatch panel 4 Delta on the exterior, Michael instructed, his tone shifting effortlessly into pure, undeniable military-grade authority. Tell him to manually bleed the pressure off the sensor relay valve for exactly 10 seconds. Not 9, not 11. Then perform a hard manual reset on the local physical breaker. Do not use the software dashboard override. The pilot didn't hesitate for a single second more. He immediately raised the radio back to his mouth, his hand no longer shaking. Ground tech, this is Hail 1. Abandon the primary diagnostic sweep. Proceed immediately to exterior hatch 4 Delta. Execute a manual bleed on the sensor relay. Count to 10 seconds followed by a hard physical breaker reset. Acknowledge. Copy that, Hail 1. Proceeding to hatch 4 Delta, the radio crackled back through the static. The next 12 minutes were the longest, most excruciatingly tense minutes in the entire history of that aircraft. The VIP billionaires in the cabin didn't dare say a single word. They sat in absolute, stunned, breathless silence, watching the man they had just mercilessly, cruelly mocked calmly command a catastrophic situation with a level of pure, unfiltered genius they couldn't even begin to comprehend. Through the thick, soundproof floorboards, they could clearly hear the muffled sounds of the ground technician working outside, the heavy metallic thud of the exterior hatch opening, the sharp, violent, hissing pshh of high-pressure air being manually bled from the bypass valve. Michael stood perfectly still in the doorway, his arms crossed, his intense eyes locked onto the pilot's main diagnostic screen. He was silently counting the seconds in his head, measuring time with absolute precision. Reset the physical breaker. Now, Michael said quietly. The pilot relayed the order instantly. For 3 terrifying, agonizing seconds, every single screen in the cockpit went completely pitch black. The emergency lights in the first-class cabin flickered ominously. Eleanor grabbed her leather armrest so hard her manicured knuckles turned stark, bone white, terrified the plane was about to shut down permanently. Then, a soft, pleasant, incredibly melodic electronic chime echoed through the tight cockpit. The massive digital screens roared back to life, illuminating the small space. But this time, the angry, flashing, terrifying red warnings were entirely gone. They had vanished without a trace. In their place was a single, beautiful, glorious word glowing in bright, steady, comforting green. Systems nominal. Clear for takeoff. The pilot let out a massive, shuddering exhale, physically dropping his head against the leather headrest in pure relief. He quickly keyed his radio. Tower, Hail 1. The fault is completely cleared. We are green across the board. Requesting immediate reinstatement of our departure slot. We are ready to fly. Hail 1, copy that. You are cleared for immediate taxi to runway 29er. Have a good flight, the tower replied. The pilot slowly turned his heavy chair around. He looked right past the billionaires. He looked past Richard. He looked directly at the quiet man in the faded charcoal shirt. The pilot stood up to his full height, reached across the threshold of the cockpit door, and extended his hand firmly. "Mr. Turner," the captain said, his voice thick with profound, ultimate respect. "Thank you. You didn't just save my job. You just saved this entire flight." Michael took his hand and gave it a firm, respectful shake. "Just doing my job, Captain. Have a safe flight to Geneva." As the pilot closed the heavy cockpit door to begin taxiing down the runway, the atmosphere inside the first-class cabin had undergone a violent, irreversible seismic transformation. Richard Hale, the billionaire owner of the jet, walked quickly down the plush aisle. He didn't stop to talk to his investors. He didn't check on Carter. He walked straight up to Michael, ignoring everyone else. "Michael," Richard said, his voice breathless, placing a heavy, incredibly grateful hand on Michael's shoulder. His face was still pale from the stress. I don't even know what to say. If we had missed that Geneva meeting, it would have cost my firm over $80 million in immediate breach of contract penalties, and the entire acquisition would have collapsed. You didn't just save the flight, Michael. You saved my entire company." The other investors were staring, their faces pale with profound shock and deep, agonizing, humiliating embarrassment. They suddenly realized the horrifying magnitude of their mistake. Eleanor Vance, the incredibly powerful woman who had arrogantly demanded Michael be thrown out of her private section, slowly, awkwardly stood up. Her arrogant, aristocratic posture was completely gone, replaced by a nervous, incredibly fragile hesitation. "Mr. Turner," Eleanor stammered, stepping forward. Her voice was entirely stripped of all its previous venom and condescension. It trembled visibly. I had absolutely no idea who you were. What exactly is it that you do for Richard's company?" Michael looked at her for a long, heavy moment. He held all the power in the room. He could have easily embarrassed her. He could have demanded an apology on her hands and knees in front of her peers. He could have cruelly thrown her own insulting words right back into her face. But true kings don't need to bark. True power doesn't need to gloat. "I solve complex problems, ma'am," Michael replied simply, his voice perfectly polite but incredibly cold and distant. That's all. He didn't brag about his genius. He didn't wave his incredible resume in their faces or demand validation. He just turned his back on them entirely and walked slowly down the aisle toward his son. Ethan was sitting up perfectly straight in his massive seat, a massive, incredibly proud smile plastered across his young face. He had just watched his dad walk into a terrifying, high-stakes situation, fearlessly face down a room full of powerful, arrogant bullies, and fix a massive, highly complex airplane with absolutely nothing but his brilliant brain and his calm voice. Richard quickly followed Michael back to the seats. "Michael, please," Richard said loudly, his voice echoing, intentionally ensuring every single billionaire in the cabin heard him crystal clearly. "Do not move to the back of this plane. Your seat is right here, in the absolute front row of first class, right next to me, where you belong." Nobody objected. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered a single word. Carter Hayes, the arrogant executive who had viciously told Michael to just go away, was now staring intensely out the oval window. His face flushed dark crimson with intense shame, utterly terrified to even make a fraction of eye contact with the single dad. The cabin became incredibly, peacefully, respectfully quiet as the massive jet engines roared back to life, pushing them back into their seats. The massive luxury jet surged down the long tarmac runway and lifted effortlessly into the sky, piercing straight through the thick gray clouds until it reached the smooth, flawless, brilliant cobalt blue of 30,000 feet. The subtle, fasten seatbelt sign dinged off. Richard leaned over from his large seat across the aisle, handing Michael a cold glass of incredibly expensive, imported, sparkling water. "Michael, I am so deeply, profoundly sorry," Richard said quietly, his tone filled with genuine, heavy regret. "I was so distracted by the frantic merger calls on the tarmac, I completely failed to introduce you to the board properly. I let them treat you like you didn't matter." Like you were beneath them. I failed you as a host, as a friend, and as a partner. Michael took a slow, refreshing sip of the water. He just smiled, a calm, deeply peaceful, untroubled expression on his tired face. Don't worry about it, Richard, Michael said softly, leaning back into the leather. People usually see exactly what they want to see. They judge the cover of the book until they desperately need something else. Ethan tugged gently on his dad's sleeve, pulling him down to whisper in his ear. Dad, were you sad when all those rich people laughed at us and told us to go away? Michael looked down at his son, his eyes filled with immense, overflowing love and hard-earned, quiet wisdom. He stroked Ethan's hair gently, wanting him to remember this moment forever. No, Ethan, I wasn't sad at all, Michael replied, his voice strong and clear, loud enough for the quiet, humbled investors sitting nearby to hear every word. Because the true value of a man isn't decided by the expensive clothes he wears, the fancy chair he sits in, or the ignorant people who laugh at him. Your value is decided by what you can actually do when the world suddenly stops working and everyone else is panicking. The flight continued perfectly smoothly toward the Swiss Alps, but the power dynamic inside that cabin had permanently, completely shifted. About an hour into the long flight, the exact same investors who had looked at Michael with utter disgust began to subtly, quietly leave their seats. It was a parade of bruised egos. They slowly, incredibly respectfully approached Michael. They didn't mock him. They didn't sneer. They handed him their heavy, gold-embossed business cards with trembling hands. They asked him quietly, desperately, about his independent consulting firm. They begged to hire him for their own corporate fleets. There was absolutely no more cruel laughter. There were no more snide, arrogant remarks, because they had all just learned a devastatingly expensive, humbling lesson. Sitting in a first-class luxury seat doesn't automatically demand respect from the world. Respect is only ever earned by the man who can step up and prove his ultimate value exactly when the world needs it most. If you firmly believe that true, undeniable value will always reveal itself when the situation desperately demands it, no matter how much people underestimate you, hit that subscribe button to follow more powerful stories of the quiet truth winning in the end. Tell us in the comments down below. Have you ever been severely underestimated, ignored, or mocked in a luxury or professional environment just because of how you looked? How did you stay completely calm and prove them completely wrong?